In September 1915, Stonehenge came up at a country auction in Salisbury as Lot 15. It sold for £6,600 to a local man who is said to have gone in that morning to buy dining chairs. This is the story of who has owned Stonehenge, what they charge for it, and what was done to it. We are going to go through the fence and the Shilling turnstile, the auction and the gift, the concrete that holds a great deal of it upright, the road that ran within yards of the stones for 50 years, and the tunnel that was argued about for a quarter of a century and then cancelled. Some of this happened well within living memory. Start with the fact that surprises people most because everything else follows from it. Stonehenge was private property, not a national monument, not crown land, not church land. It stood in a field belonging to a family in the ordinary way that a barn or a hedge belongs to a family, and it had done for centuries. The family were the Antrobuses, who owned the Amesbury Abbey estate. Stonehenge sat on their land, and legally it was theirs to do as they liked with, which included charging you to look at it, and which at one point included the possibility of selling it to somebody who wanted to take it away. And if you are old enough to have driven west on the A303 before 2013, you have your own memory of this. You came over the rise, the stones appeared on the right, and you sat in the queue looking at them through the window with the traffic barely moving. For 50 years, the main road to the west of England ran a few yards from the most famous prehistoric monument in Europe, and everybody simply got used to it. That road is part of the story too, and so is the fact that one of them is not there now, and that the other very nearly went underground at a cost that would have bought a hospital. But it begins with a fence. In 1901, one of the great uprights leaned so far that it was clearly about to fall, and the owner had it straightened and set in concrete. To pay for the work and to control the crowds, he fenced the whole monument and put a man on a gate charging a shilling to go in. Straightening a stone means digging round its base, and the excavation that went with it was the first genuinely scientific dig ever carried out at Stonehenge, recorded layer by layer. So, the fence, the shilling, and the first real archaeology all arrive in the same year for the same reason: a private owner had a stone about to fall and had to pay for fixing it. The public reaction was ferocious. Stonehenge had been open moorland that anybody could walk onto, and people had been walking onto it, picnicking on it, and chipping bits off it as souvenirs for generations. A fence and a turnstile looked like theft of something that had never belonged to anybody in the way that mattered. There was a court case about the right of way. The owner won it. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. A great many of the stones you photograph today was straightened, re-erected, and set in concrete during the 20th century. So is what stands on Salisbury Plain, the monument, or is it a 20th century idea of what the monument should look like? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. Take the ownership first, because it explains the rest. The Antrobus family had bought the Amesbury estate in the 1820s. Stonehenge came with it, the way a lake or a wood comes with an estate, and for most of the 19th century, nobody thought about it very hard. It was a curiosity on the family's land, visited by antiquarians, painted by artists, and generally left alone. What changed was the volume of visitors. The railway put Salisbury within reach of London, and by the end of the century, Stonehenge was getting the kind of numbers that damage a thing. And the damage was not accidental. For the better part of a century, it was normal practice for a visitor to arrive with a hammer or to hire one locally and knock a piece off a standing stone to take home. That was not vandalism, as the Victorians understood it. It was souvenir collecting done openly by respectable people in the same spirit as pressing a flower. Multiply one chip by 100 years of visitors, and you have a monument being quietly eaten. The family had a real problem, and the fence was a real answer to it, whatever it looked like from the outside. There is a lesson in that which applies well beyond Salisbury Plain. A thing that belongs to everybody in feeling and to nobody in law gets used until it is gone. The moment somebody puts a fence up, they are called a thief, and the moment nobody does, the thing disappears a chip at a time. There is one more thing about that period that almost nobody knows, and it changes how you read the sale. Salisbury Plain was, by then, the British Army's largest training ground. It had been bought up for the purpose from the 1890s onwards, and by the First World War, the country around Stonehenge was full of camps, ranges, and railways built for the war effort. An aerodrome was constructed for the Royal Flying Corps, a very short distance from the stones, with hangars and huts in plain sight of them. So the monument spent the war years surrounded by military building on a scale nobody had ever attempted there. Aircraft flew over it daily. There was serious anxiety at the time about what the vibration and the traffic were doing to it and about what else might be put up next door. That is the setting for what happened next. Stonehenge did not come to market as a serene antiquity in an empty landscape. It came to market in the middle of a militarized plain at the height of a war, from an estate that had just lost its heir. Then the war came closer, and the story turns on a death. Sir Edmund Antrobus, the heir to the estate, was killed in action in 1915. He had no son. With the succession broken and the estate facing the costs that follow a death, the whole thing was put up for sale, and Stonehenge went into the catalogue with everything else. Read that sentence again slowly. Stonehenge went into a sale catalogue. It was Lot 15, described in the particulars as the monument together with about 30 acres of downland around it. The auction was held at the Palace Theatre in Salisbury on the 21st of September 1915. Stonehenge was one lot among many in a sale that also disposed of farms, cottages, woodland, and the ordinary furniture of a great estate, which is exactly how a family's world is dismantled when the succession fails and the bills fall due. There was a good deal of nervousness beforehand about who might buy it, and the nervousness was reasonable because nobody had any control over the answer. And here the story acquires the detail everybody remembers. Cecil Chubb was a local man who had risen a very long way. He was born in the village of Shrewton, a few miles from the Stones, the son of a saddler. He was clever. He was educated at the village school, and then at Cambridge he became a barrister, and he married the daughter of a wealthy family whose asylum business he came to run. That biography matters because it tells you what he was on the day of the sale, a self-made local man with money sitting in a room in Salisbury while the estate he had grown up beside was broken into lots. He went to the auction, and the account that has come down to us is that he had gone to buy something ordinary, a set of dining chairs in most tellings, and bought Stonehenge instead on the spur of the moment. He later said something to the effect that a Salisbury man ought to buy it, so that it did not go to an outsider. Whether that was the reason at the time or a reason found afterwards, nobody can now say. The dining chairs may well be a later embellishment too. Stories about a famous purchase acquire a good anecdote, the way a coat acquires lint, and this one has been told so often that the original account is hard to separate from the polish on it. What is documented is the date, the lot number, the price, and the buyer, and those are enough. The price was £6,600, which is the number this channel exists to make you look at properly. £6,600 in 1915 was a very substantial sum, several times what a comfortable family house cost, and enough to keep a professional household for many years. But set it against what was being sold. The most famous prehistoric structure in Europe and 30 acres of Wiltshire changed hands for less than the price of a modest London street of terraced houses. The reason is not that people did not value it. It is that nobody could work out what it was worth because there was nothing to compare it with and no income to capitalize. An auctioneer values a farm on its rent and a house on what similar houses fetch. Stonehenge had no rent, no comparable, and no obvious buyer, and a thing with no market is cheap almost by definition. There is a further reason, and it is the part that would have worried anybody thinking clearly that morning. The lot came with obligations and no revenue. Whoever bought it inherited the fence, the wardens, the repairs, the lawsuits, and the public anger, and inherited no way of paying for any of it beyond a shilling a head from whoever turned up. In accounting terms, Stonehenge was a liability with a view. That is why the price is low, and it is also why the buyer gave it away. He had bought something that cost money to own. It is worth saying what the alternative might have been because it was genuinely open. There was nothing in law to stop a buyer fencing it off completely, or charging what he liked, or selling stones out of it, and there had been serious talk in earlier decades of an American buyer taking the whole thing abroad as other British antiquities were taken. Nothing about the outcome was guaranteed by anything except the character of the man who happened to raise his hand. 3 years later, Chubb gave it away. In October 1918, he handed Stonehenge to the nation by a deed of gift to the Commissioners of Works. Britain was in the last weeks of the war and had rather a lot on its mind, and the gift was accepted quietly. The conditions attached to it are the interesting part, and they are still doing work today. Chubb specified that local people should have free or preferential access, and he put a ceiling on what could be charged to anybody else. The figure written into the deed was 1 shilling. A shilling. Written into the document that governs what is now the most visited prehistoric site in Britain, by a man who had every reason to believe a shilling would always mean roughly what it meant to him. It is a small, precise, entirely reasonable Edwardian number, and it demonstrates in one line the problem with writing a price into a permanent legal instrument, because a shilling is now 5 pence, and the actual admission is a great deal more than that. Chubb was made a baronet the following year. He is more or less the only person in British history to be given a hereditary title for buying a monument by accident and then not keeping it. Consider what the gift actually transferred, because it is more than a field. It handed the state an asset with no income, a legal cap on its charging, an angry public with strong opinions about access, a monument that was structurally unsafe in places, and an obligation that would run forever. No commercial buyer would have taken that on at any price, which is precisely why it had to be given rather than sold. And the timing was extraordinary. In October 1918, the British government was fighting the closing weeks of the largest war in its history and borrowing on a scale that would take the country the rest of the century to work through. Into that, a barrister from Wiltshire handed over Stonehenge, and somebody in an office signed for it. Now the part that people find genuinely unsettling, and that the question at the start of this video turns on. Stonehenge has fallen down repeatedly over 4,000 years. That is what happens to standing stones on chalk. The ground moves, the packing settles, and eventually a stone leans and goes over. A great trilithon fell in 1797. Others had gone long before. By the 19th century, a good deal of what visitors saw was lying flat. So, it was put back up, not once, but in a series of campaigns across the 20th century. The work in 1901 straightened the leaning upright. There was a large program after the First World War and further campaigns in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, during which fallen stones were raised, sockets were excavated, and the bases of the great uprights were secured in concrete. That is the sentence to sit with: concrete. A substantial part of what you photograph today is standing because it was lifted by a crane within living memory and set in a modern foundation. The trilithon that fell in 1797 was put back up in 1958. Somebody watching this was alive that year. The scale of the 1950s and 60s work is the thing that gets left out of the guidebooks. This was not a matter of nudging a stone. True. Uprights weighing many tons were lifted clear with cranes, their sockets were excavated, and they were lowered back and bedded in. Photographs of it exist, and they look like a building site, because that is what it was. And it was not controversial at the time. The prevailing view was that a monument you could see standing was worth more to the public than a monument lying in a field, and that the evidence for where each stone had stood was good enough to act on. Both of those were reasonable positions, and both are still arguable. What has changed is confidence. A conservation team today would be far more reluctant, would document far more before touching anything, and would probably leave a fallen stone where it lay. That is not because the earlier generation was careless. It is because they used up the option. You can put a stone back up once. You cannot unput it. One thing before we go on. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. None of that was done in secret, and none of it was done badly. It was done by serious archaeologists with the best intentions, using the standards of their day, and the alternative was watching the monument fall over. But it does mean that the outline on the postcard is a choice. Somebody decided which stones went back and where and at what angle based on the evidence they had. And the cost of those decisions was carried by the taxpayer because by then it was a state monument. That is the quiet consequence of Chubb's gift. A private owner charging a shilling had to fund repairs out of gate money. A national monument gets repaired out of public funds. And the public funds are also what pay for the archaeology, the wardens, the fencing, and, eventually, the roads. Which brings us to the road and to the largest number in this entire story. 2 roads ran at Stonehenge. Scum-age! The A344 passed within a few yards of the heel stone, so close that it effectively cut the monument off from the avenue that leads away from it. The A303, the main route from London to the West Country, ran past the site and turned into a famous bottleneck every summer, with holiday traffic crawling for miles. For decades, everybody agreed this was intolerable and nobody could agree what to do about it. Moving a main road is expensive. Moving it near a World Heritage Site through a landscape stuffed with buried archaeology is expensive in a different and much worse way, because every yard of it has to be dug by hand first. The eventual answer for the smaller road was simple, and it happened. The A344 was closed in 2013 and grassed over. The old visitor facilities beside the stones were removed, and a new visitor center was built well over a mile away with a shuttle to carry people the rest of the way. The monument got its landscape back. That project cost something in the region of £27 million, and it is the best money anybody has spent on Stonehenge in a century. It is also a good illustration of what a monument like this actually costs to run once the state owns it. Well over 1 million people a year come through, which needs car parking, lavatories, staff, a road, a shuttle service, conservation, and a great deal of grass cutting, and every one of those is a permanent annual bill against an asset that Cecil Chubb could not give away fast enough. The difference is that the state can carry it, and a private owner charging a shilling never could. That is the actual argument for public ownership of things like this, and it has nothing to do with sentiment. The answer for the main road was a tunnel, and the tunnel is a story about money. The scheme was to put the A303 underground for a couple of miles so that the traffic disappeared entirely from the site. It was proposed, costed, argued over, taken to court, redesigned, approved, challenged, approved again, and challenged again across roughly a quarter of a century. The estimated cost climbed the whole time, from hundreds of millions of pounds into the billions. In 2024, the government cancelled it. By that point, a very large sum had already been spent on surveys, designs, archaeological assessments, public inquiries, and legal proceedings for a tunnel that will not now be dug. That is the pattern this channel keeps finding. The cost of deciding is real money. It is spent whether or not anything gets built, and nobody ever puts it on the plaque. And notice why it got so expensive. The reason a tunnel there costs billions rather than millions is the archaeology. The whole landscape is a burial ground, and a scheme like that requires every yard of the route to be investigated in advance by hand, with the possibility that what is found stops the work. In other words, the value of the thing being protected is exactly what makes protecting it unaffordable. That is not a failure of anybody's project management. It is the arithmetic of the site. So, put the whole ledger together. A landowning family charged a shilling and were called thieves for it. A barrister bought the monument for £6,600 at a country auction and gave it away 3 years later, writing a shilling cap into the deed. The state then spent decades and a great deal of public money putting the stones back up, and then decades more and a great deal more money arguing about a road before deciding not to build the tunnel after all. At every stage, the same thing is true. Nobody was doing anything unreasonable, and the bill kept arriving anyway. Now go back to the question, is what stands on Salisbury Plain the monument or a 20th century idea of it? Here is the case that it is a reconstruction. Stones that had been flat for centuries were raised. Their positions were inferred rather than known. They sit in concrete that no Neolithic builder poured. The skyline you photograph was substantially decided by archaeologists in the 1950s and 60s, and if a different team had made different judgments, the postcard would look different. And here is the case that it is the monument. Every stone standing there is the original stone, quarried and dragged and shaped by people 4,500 years ago. Nothing was invented and nothing was replaced. Putting a fallen thing back where the evidence says it stood is not making a new thing. It is closer to standing up a chair that has fallen over than to building a new chair. Most people who know the site well hold both of those at once, and the honest position is that it is a real monument that has been carefully helped to stand. There is one last thing worth ending on, and it is the smallest number in the story. That 1 shilling in Cecil Chubb's deed was written by a man who had owned Stonehenge for 3 years and wanted to make sure that ordinary people could always get in. It was a generous instinct, precisely expressed, and it was made worthless by 70 years of inflation without anybody having to break it. Britain is full of those charitable trusts founded to pay a fixed sum to the poor of a parish. Almshouse endowments set at a rent nobody could live on now. Bequests that specify an amount rather than a share. The lesson is the same every time, and it is the most useful thing in this video. If you want a promise to survive, do not write a number into it. Write a proportion or a principle or a right. A number is a photograph of 1 year, and the years keep coming. Chubb got the sentiment exactly right, and the mechanism exactly wrong, and the stones he bought by accident have outlasted his shilling by a very long way. He died in 1934, and the baronetcy died out within 2 generations. The estate he grew up beside is gone. The family that owned the monument for 90 years is a footnote, and the aerodrome that worried everybody has vanished back into grass. The stones are still there, which is the one outcome nobody in this story arranged. Not the family who fenced them, not the barrister who bought them, not the archaeologists who stood them back up, and not the engineers who spent a quarter of a century designing a tunnel that was never dug.